Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the INTP game. Today, I want to talk about something very particular. But of course, I'm always discussing something very particular if I'm discussing anything. So, the particularity of the issues I discuss and the way that I discuss them is appealing. But this one may be a bit more controversial, and I'm not trying to be controversial, but please, I would ask viewers that watch this, don't write it off as the opinion of a cis white male, because it is the opinion of a cis white male, but it's ultimately the opinion of me. And we all have our own unique experiences and backgrounds, regardless of our race, sex, sexual identity. These are all superficial characteristics that do define us quite a bit, but they ultimately, to me, become not distractions, but limiting labels. And I really don't like how oftentimes what I propose or what I will say is then in a very racist kind of sexist fashion written off as bogus simply because of my race and sex, assuming that I have privileges that make me biased and assuming that I have privileges that make me biased in some way and cloud my objectivity. I do think that humans are capable of being objective, and that's not just a defense mechanism I'm creating in my mind because I'm a cis white male. And, you know, so that just has to be said from the very beginning. First of all, despite the superficial traits that define me in other people's eyes, I come from just a family of I'm an American and come from a family of immigrants of Irish, Italian, English, and French immigrants. And so I'm not a descendant of the gentry class and of any upper class modality. And I so and even if I were, I don't really feel that this has materially privileged me directly in any way. The chain of the chain of what connects me to them is only blood. And so, in any case, I have to start that way. Now, one thing that bothers me is that we seem to be what people of, I guess, with me and racism and these issues. There's this very strong desire for me to want to move beyond race in some way, and to want to move beyond even considering it, you know. And I get that there are historical reasons that might justify considering it, and I think that's fair. I think it provides a balance of some kind against and redistributes the power of different groups in some way, different cultural groups. But I think that we're all human, and I think that I just don't see it as right that 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 race is conceived as a part of identity. And I think the tendency to conceive of race as a part of identity is not empowering but limiting. Um, and there's really nothing empowering, even for people that are race conscious, to think this way. I mean, what is it? It matters historically, and there may be historical effects that permeate into the present day. I'm willing to concede that. Certainly, I think that slavery happened and discrimination, overt, widespread discrimination in both the North and the South happened, and that there are legacy effects of some kind. There could be legacy effects that trickle down into the present from the past and then would influence the future on the present's influence on the future. And I'm willing to concede that. And I'm sensitive at least to the perspective, even if my personality type and my own way of thinking causes me to, you know, regarded as meaningless or arbitrary, but certainly it's meaningful for those that think it is meaningful. And I think that it does provide a balance, right? I mean, in some way, there must be some balance that it provides where we are recognizing history and some of the errors that were made in history, human errors. We're calling attention to those errors. And by calling attention to those historical errors and human errors, we can then prevent the errors into the future. So I take that, right? I take that there is some utility to race discourse and historical race discourse. Of course there is. Of course there is, because we don't want to repeat history. And this is all. I think that's fine, and so I've provided a balance to my own perspective, and there is a balance, and that should be um, ultimately causes me to regulate my own perspectives so as to be more objective. And so, but I don't really think that coming just from a family of I'm just a descendant of many European immigrants. Um, uh, you know, and I don't necessarily think that my lineage necessarily predisposes me to any given perspective, right? I'm both conservative and liberal on different issues, depending on what you ask me and how I think about different issues. So I get it, and I get it. I don't always agree with it, but I get it, and I'm just trying to understand things better and pose a balance of my own to other attempts to provide a balance, because even that needs to be balanced if we want to maintain our objectivity and seek real truth. And my desire for logical validity and truth has nothing to do with my sex or my race. I'd love to see that explained to me. I'd love to see that one explained to me. Because if that were the case, then we could say something about individuals based on their race and sex. But you assuming that you can say something about me based on my race and my sex is itself racist. And that's bothersome to me because I'm an individual too and have my own thoughts on things. And so this is not what I think. I just don't see that there's a correlation there between my perspectives and my race or my perspectives and my sex. And the moment we think that there's some attachment between the two or correlation between how I see the world and what color my skin is and what genitals I have, well, both of that's a kind of racism and sexism implicitly. It's the reverse of the same. Okay. The title of the video is How Egalitarianism Devolves into Reverse Racism. There's this tendency, as the result of historical discrimination of minority groups and the oppression of minority groups, which I acknowledge in many ways is historically valid. There was for African Americans in this country, there is the legacy of slavery, there is the legacy of discrimination. For Mexican Americans in this country, there is the legacy of exploitation, and there is the legacy of restricted immigration and whatnot. For Chinese Americans, there is the legacy of exploitation and discrimination. But you have to remember too that racism and discrimination are not specific to whites, and that these groups even antagonize each other in many ways in a kind of racist or sexist fashion. And there's so that's all that I'm saying. But the problem is that when we're striving to be egalitarian, right? We're striving to be egalitarian now because we recognize that history is filled with instances of the opposite of that, of the discrimination, of slavery, of oppression, of exploitation. And So we want then in the present day for things to be egalitarian. There to be some level of equality of opportunity, right? True equality of opportunity and of rights and of political privileges between groups. And that's an inarguable good. It's inarguably a good. It's a very easily defensible good. I don't see anyone being able to make any kind of utility argument for group dominance based on race or sex. But we have to remember, too, that if we truly want egalitarianism, right, we must be egalitarian, truly egalitarian in our thinking. And the problem is that modern egalitarianism becomes almost paradoxical, where, and I know that no one wants to hear this or hear me say it, but modern egalitarianism paradoxically becomes almost racist in a reverse way, because we think we want to grant plus factors to groups that were historically discriminated against. And we want to, in the process of giving a plus factor to these groups, we inherently give a minus factor to other groups, historically dominant groups, historical majority groups, rather than historical minority groups. And in this process of giving some groups a plus factor, of showing a racial preference or a sex preference for those groups, and then applying a minus factor, either based on sex or race, to other groups, we ultimately, that's not egalitarian. It's not egalitarian. And what that ultimately does is it creates future effects that don't really correct the fundamental issue and don't lead us toward a more egalitarian state of things. It's almost a kind of historical revenge, where you were at the top then, so now you have to be at the bottom now, and I get to be at the top now. It's a kind of envy motivated thing or revenge motivated thing. And I just don't really see that as actually rectifying any of the errors of history. They're errors of history. History is done. It's decided. History is dead in this sense. It's deceased. We're all just people in the present, moving in the present, operating in the present, moving into the future. And what this reverse racist kind of plus factor to minorities, minus factor to majorities, historical minorities and historical majorities does into the future is it only perpetuates the fundamental problem where some groups are preferred over others. And that's not okay, right? Because then we're led to a state of things in the future where there's still this fundamental imbalance, right? This fundamental unegalitarian imbalance. And now we've propped up, now we just have another kind of group dominance, of tribe dominance, of race dominance, of sex dominance, that is simply, it's exactly the same thing, but it's dressed up in different garb. It's just another kind of group dominance. It's another dominant group. It's another unegalitarian kind of group dominance. And so I just don't think that's necessarily a solution. I think history is deceased. It's decided. It's done. And none of us that exist today, right, can change historical facts. And we can't rectify them either. That's impossible. That would be to change history. History is history. It's done. There's nothing we can do about that in the present. and we don't ultimately make the future more egalitarian by applying these paradoxical, unegalitarian um, plus factors to certain race and sex groups over others. It just creates the same dynamic of class and tribe vengeance and tribe animosity and tribe disdain, disdain between tribes, disdain between groups, disdain between peoples that really should be cooperating rather than competing. This competitive mindset that we have, this historical revenge mindset that ultimately props up an unegalitarian state of things by which some race and sex groups get minus factors and others get plus factors, only perpetuate the dynamic that we want to do away with. That's the fundamental truth. And if we can't, it's horrible. There are a number of dismal realities that must be accepted about life. Life is difficult. History was horrible in many ways. We're not going to make the future any better through seeking revenge competitively upon each other and being envy and revenge motivated. And it's just not going to create a more egalitarian state of things. And because it perpetuates the fundamental dynamic that is the problem. So people really have to look at these things more fundamentally, more logically. And if we cannot, to the extent that we cannot do that, we only create another kind of history for another kind of people in the future, right? I'm sorry, there's an engine outside that's just revving. It's absolutely horrible. So if you hear that, I apologize. But it only creates the same dynamic. And so we must to rectify history, which can't be done in the first place. But if the proper way of rectifying history is simply diverging from history, right? To rectify an error, a human error in history, we must diverge. I'm closing the window. I'm sorry. To truly rectify the patterns of history, we have to depart and diverge from history completely. To correct and rectify practices that we would regard as immoral, we have to depart from those practices. We can't become the thing that we are against, right? But in rebelling it by default, we become it. And so ultimately, it only allows the same dynamic to perpetuate. In order to get beyond that dynamic, we must get beyond the dynamic by recognizing it for what it is, right? Making society perhaps more meritocratic. Its privileges seem to be the privilege people have, tend to be very much tied to the income of their parents and where they grew up. And it doesn't really have much to do with their race per se or their sex per se. It more has to do with legacy, right? At family legacy of some kind. To make things more meritocratic, we would have to give plus and minus factors in a different way in college admissions and in employment decisions and in elections. And to the extent that we are not able to do that, we will perpetuate this dynamic. And so it's only to say that in the modern day, it is true that often supposed egalitarianism does devolve into a kind of reverse racism. And, you know, hi, yes, this is a live stream. So I keep forgetting, usually when I post these videos, I'm just kind of ranting. I'm just a lonely ranter. So it's nice to have a guest. Um, So it's not really a controversial point, but it's a controversial issue. So it's a non-controversial point about a controversial issue. Um, and so I don't want to absorb the the controversy in any way, or become actively controversial. I don't think that's productive. But in any case, the basic idea of the video, um, that I've posted here is, simply that in the modern day, um, supposed egalitarianism does kind of devolve, more or less into almost a reverse racism or a reverse sexism, um, that we would ultimately regard as undesirable. Aliens, for instance, if we took a God's eye perspective, looking down on things, we'd recognize that the way that we the ways in which we've attempted to rectify the errors of history ultimately only perpetuate the errors of history. Um, yeah. Um, so that was the main point that I wanted to make. I don't have any other points to make here. But if there, if for instance, if the guest, I notice we have one viewer here who wants to pose any questions, maybe clarifying questions about what I'm talking about here, or has any, depending on how long the viewer's been watching, um, maybe wants to send some articles or pose some points. So I'll leave the live stream open, for the next couple of minutes, and to entertain questions and comments. And and if there aren't any, then I will end the stream. But I think I've made my point as coherently as possible. Okay, so it doesn't seem there are any questions or comments. So I'll end the stream here. For viewers that did not get to catch into the stream into the last minute, you can go back and watch the live replay of the video, which will be posted to my channel. Be sure to like and subscribe, and have a great evening. Thank you.